The 12 Hours of Sebring always seems to bring late drama. Last year, it was a massive crash that took out the leaders. Thankfully, this year, it was not a crash for the leaders, but rather an incredible battle in the closing laps. However, there was a massive accident that took out the dominant car just a couple hours before that. This is your 12 Hours of Sebring race report. Man, Sebring sure seems to not disappoint us. Before we get to all the action that happened in the 12 Hours of Sebring, there's a couple of news stories to touch on. First, and perhaps the biggest news coming out of the weekend, is that Cadillac and Chip Ganassi Racing are parting ways at the end of the season. Chip Ganassi Racing was of course instrumental in the development of the V-Series R and have run a single car in IMSA in the World Endurance Championship for the first 2 seasons of its existence. With no immediate replacement named in the announcement for who's going to run that second car in IMSA as well as who's going to operate the WEC program, there are still a lot of question marks and speculation that I'm going to dive into in a video later on. But as of right now, the leading rumor, at least for the IMSA side, is that Action Express Racing is the favorite to take on that second Cadillac entry. The other big news story that came out of the weekend was a bit of a shock as IMSA announced its 2025 schedule. Yes, that means the 2025 schedule was announced before the second race of the 2024 season was even run. And this is also about 5 months earlier than we saw the schedule released last year. Now, next year's calendar remains relatively unchanged from this year with the same tracks and very similar dates. It also still has some notable omissions. In fact, I did a whole video on the schedule release that you can go and check out as well. Now, before the big race on Saturday, there were a number of support series races, as there always are at IMSA events. The Michelin Pilot Challenge race, and they had a pretty messy race go on. They had 3 back-to-back full course yellows that really disrupted the running in this one before they finally got a longer stint towards the end. And in Grand Sport, it was ultimately the number 71 Rebel Rock Racing entry running that brand new Aston Martin Vantage GT4 Evo that would take the top step of the podium. Frank Depew was starting that car and Robin Liddell brought it to the finish line. Meanwhile, in TCR, it was back-to-back wins for Mikey Taylor and Chris Miller as the number 17 JDC Miller Motorsports Audi backed up their Daytona win with a win at Sebring. In Lamborghini Super Trofeo, it was Kiko Porto and Nico Jamin that took the Race 1 victory. Meanwhile, in Race 2, it was Ernie Francis Jr. and Giano Torino that took the win there. In Porsche Carrera Cup North America, it was Loic Hartog that took the win in Race 1, and Gustav Burden that took the win in Race 2. And of course, we can't talk about IMSA Sport Series without talking about the Whelen Mazda MX-5 Cup. In Race 1, it was Tyler Gonzalez with a last lap pass to clinch the win there. And in Race 2, we saw a photo finish with Weston Workman beating Connor Zilic to the line by 3/1000ths of a second. It was an incredible battle to the finish. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you go and check it out. Moving on to the WeatherTech Championship now. And before we get into the race, let's touch on qualifying. In GTD, it was the Windward Racing Mercedes, driven by Russell Ward, who set the fastest lap time there. However, they would not pass tech. It turns out they had an illegal sensor on that car, and as a result, they would be demoted to the back of the class for the start of the race. They were actually not the only cars that would fail tech, though. All 4 of the brand new Corvettes would also fail tech, and they all started at the back of their respective GT classes. In GTD Pro was the number 14 Vassar Sullivan Lexus, driven by Jack Hawksworth, who set the fastest lap time there, a 158.7. Meanwhile, in LMP2, it was Spike, driven by PJ Hyatt for AO Racing. They took the pole there with a lap time of a 152.142 seconds. And in GTP, it was a bit of a messy session, with the number 6 Porsche actually having a pretty big off on the exit of turn 1. They looped around, put it into the concrete wall, and would ultimately bring out the red flag. Thankfully, though, there were a few minutes left in the session after everything was all cleared up, and we were able to go out and complete qualifying. When it was all said and done, it was the number 31 Action Express Racing Cadillac, driven by Pipo Girani, that would pick up the pole. He did that with a lap time of a 148.152, and he beat out fellow Cadillac driver Sebastian Bourdais in the 0-1, who was about a 10th behind. Despite the condensed session that we saw for qualifying, the Cadillac still displayed almost effortless pace, with Pipo Girani actually not even getting in a good final lap when his tires would have probably been at their best because he was stuck behind some traffic. Don't worry, that pace from the Cadillacs would certainly carry forward into the race. Alright, now jumping forward to this year's 12 Hours of Sebring, it was overall a pretty messy one, and it showed that almost right from the word go. Now, the prototypes would be able to navigate the opening corners cleanly, but the same could not be said for the GT cars, as the number 62 Risi Competizione Ferrari spun in front of virtually the entire GT field. It was a miracle that nobody hit them as they were spinning across the track. However, while taking avoiding action, the number 9 Pfaff McLaren made contact with the number 70 Inception Racing McLaren and ultimately caused the number 9 to suffer a puncture. This would be the start of a long day for Pfaff. As the race would go on, there would be numerous full course yellows and multiple cars that would drop out of the running, but at the halfway mark of the race, there was still a surprising number of cars on the lead lap. In fact, I mentioned it on X, every single GTP car was on the lead lap, and that included the new SC63. In other classes, 9 of 13 in LMP2 were on the lead lap, 10 of the 12 GTD Pro cars also were on the lead lap, and 16 of the 22 GTD starters were still on the lead lap. The second half of this race, though, would be different, and it would be plagued by yellow flags. In fact, there were a total of 12 in this race for the 12-hour race, but ultimately at the end of it, we got some incredible racing to make up for all this yellow. You see, in GTD, we saw virtually every manufacturer have a strong car at one point or another during the race. We kind of expected it to be pretty close and very difficult to pick a winner here. That indeed turned out to be true. Actually, as the weekend unfolded, the car that looked the fastest, the Mercedes, I had my doubts as to whether they could actually carry that pace through into the race. However, my doubts were silenced as it was the number 57 Windward Racing Mercedes who rebounded after their qualifying penalty to take the GTD win. Indy Donchi, Russell Ward, and Philippe Ellis took the win in the GTD classes. They were clearly the strongest car in this class, and after their Rolex 24 win, they can proudly say that they've taken the unofficial 36 Hours of Florida win. The number 47 Centelar Racing Ferrari and the number 120 Wright Motorsports Porsche rounded out the podium. GTD Pro saw some incredible battles through this one, and we actually saw 6 different manufacturers lead the race. And in fact, there were 5 different cars that led 25 laps or more during this one. And don't forget, there were only 12 cars in this class. With this class, though, the main focus was on the racing at the end of it. Things got a little bit rough at the end of this one, and there were some interesting post-race quotes that came out. One was most notably from Denny Hunkadea, who was punted off by Rexy in the final laps and was most vocal, saying to Sportscar 365 that the driving standards at the end of the race were shocking. Seems like it gets dark, there's not enough footage from all the cars, so people just decide it's time to go elbows out. I like racing and fighting, but I like hard and fair racing. This hard racing would continue right down to the finish line. After Jack Hawksworth made a great pass through turn 1 on the Risi Ferrari, the number 62 would battle back its side-by-side run to the finish that ultimately saw the number 14 Vassar Sullivan Lexus of Jack Hawksworth, Ben Barnicoat, and Kyle Kirkwood take the win. Number 62 would end up 0.12 of a second short, while the number 19 Iron Lynx Lamborghini would round out the podium. The final few hours of this race featured a lot of full course yellows, and perhaps the class that it impacted the most was LMP2. In the second half of the race, the Era Motorsports LMP2 suffered a puncture and wound up down in the class order. However, the team then opted to go for some bold strategy moves, really in the hopes of a few full course yellows coming out late in the race. A number of cautions would come out in the closing stages, and pair that with some great fuel saving by Connor Zilich, and that strategy that they employed ultimately worked out for them. At the end of this race, it was the number 18 Era Motorsports entry of Connor Zilich, Dwight Merriman, and Ryan DeLille that took victory. They were joined on the podium by the number 11 TDS Racing entry and the number 22 United Autosports car. Also, a shout out to Sean Creech Motorsports, the only Ligier in the class. They ended up finishing in 4th. I think there's little question here though, GTP gave us the best battle of them all. After spending much of the race in the middle of the pack showing kind of average pace, the number 40 Wayne Taylor Racing Acura came alive when the sun went down. Meanwhile, a story that was unfolding this entire race was just how dominant Cadillac looked. The race was paced by either the 2023 Sebring 12-hour winners, the number 31, until a massive accident took them out of contention, or the beautiful Gold 01, who led a large portion of this race after that incident. However, as many of these races do, it came down to a final hour sprint to the finish once again. For the final 25-minute dash to the finish line, it was the 01 Cadillac that was leading the number 40 Acura. However, at this point, the Acura was showing incredible pace. In those final minutes, we saw a great battle, and from my point of view, was a fair and clean battle. However, Sebastian Bourdais, who was in the 01 at the time, criticized the driver of the number 40, Luis Delatraz, for his driving standards when the race was done. But regardless, the pair were able to keep things clean, and after an incredible battle, the number 40 would end up sneaking by the 01 in the final minutes. They would hold on, and the number 40 Wayne Taylor Racing Acura ARX06 of Luis Delatraz, Jordan Taylor, and Colton Herta would cross the finish line first. Most notably, this is the first win for Wayne Taylor Racing in the LMDH era, and they were joined on the podium by the 01 Cadillac and the number 7 Porsche Penske 963. Really though, the story of the race and the story of the weekend for me in GTP was the number 31 car. They had an absolutely dominant car. And before their massive crash that took them out of this one, they had led 79 laps in this race. A couple of the other GTP manufacturers, BMW and Porsche, they had their moments throughout specifically the heat of the day. That seemed to be when those two cars showed glimpses of pace. But ultimately, when the sun went down, they didn't really seem to have what it took to contest the win. And then of course, I don't know how we've made it this long without talking about the Lamborghini SC63. They completed every lap in their first IMSA race. Sure, it might have been helped by some of the full course yellows, but they survived, and I think that's got to be mission accomplished for them. A good first showing for them, a 7th place finish to go with it, and now they carry on to the 6 Hours of the Glen in the middle of the summer. Overall, I thought this race was pretty darn good, and a significant number of you thought the same. In a poll that I put up on the YouTube community tab, 97% of you agreed that you thought the race was good. However, there are a couple of things from this race that I want to note that I thought weren't so great. Whether it's just the result of there being more cars out on the track, or there's actually a different mindset with drivers right now, there was a heck of a lot of aggressive driving that we saw. And frankly, the driving standards were concerning at times. We saw instances of drivers getting blasted off the track by no fault of their own, such as Catherine Legg, who got shunted off by the number 6 Porsche, and I'm absolutely shocked that they didn't get a penalty. Although karma would give them a penalty just a few laps later with some damage that they picked up. Or you could look at Lauren Heinrich in Rexy. He punted off one of the Corvettes in the final laps. Now, they would end up getting a penalty, but all of this is just worth keeping an eye on here. As grid sizes increase, are we going to continue to see driving standards slip? Or can we get these drivers to reel things in a little bit, be maybe a bit more patient, and hopefully reduce some of these unnecessary accidents that we see? With that though, let's take a look at the point standings presented by P1 Web Development. If you're looking for a custom website, then head to p1webdevelopment.com/the S's, or click the link in the description. In GTP, it's a tie at the top of the standings between the number 7 Porsche Penske Motorsports Porsche and the number 40 Wayne Taylor Racing with Andretti Acura. They both have 706 points and are 106 points ahead of the number 31 Whelen Engineering Cadillac. In LMP2, it's the number 18 Era Motorsports entry. Of course, they've won the first 2 races of the season. They have 741 points. That's 127 points ahead of the number 74 Riley Motorsports entry. In GTD Pro, it's the number 62 Risi Competizione Ferrari with 722 points. That's 98 points ahead of the number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW. And in GTD, it's the number 57 Winward Racing Mercedes that has 725 points. That's 136 points ahead of the number 47 Centelar Racing Ferrari. IMSA now has a bit of a break until their next round out at Long Beach. That race does go April 19th and 20th. But until then, you can learn all about IMSA's 2025 calendar right here. A huge shout out to all of the channel supporters. If you too want to support the show, then you can head to patreon.com/offintheS's or click the join button below. Once again, thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great race weekend and doesn't go off in the S's.